Part 2. When did the Bible appear? It is generally accepted that the Bible was written more than 2,000 years ago. How then could its pages contain a description of the construction of the Moscow Kremlin, which happened in the 16th century? Some historians suggest that the architect merely took the description of ancient Jerusalem from the book of Nehemiah as a model and built the Moscow fortress according to the biblical description. But the authors of the New Chronology don't find this explanation convincing either. They believe the age of the biblical texts are exaggerated. As we discovered, the Bible was written and edited up to the 16th and even 17th centuries. We studied the timeline for the creation of the Bible for a long time and came to the conclusion that the modern version of the Bible is a reasonably late version. The Bible today is a collection of certain books, and many believe that it appeared a long time ago. Some say 1,000 years ago, some say more. But in actuality, the contents of the biblical canon aren't that ancient. Until the 16th century, the books of the Old and New Testaments existed separately, and a unified canon didn't even exist. There are around 500 Slavo-Russian biblical manuscripts from the 9th to the 13th centuries in Russian archives. There are the Gospels, Psalters, Revelations, and others. But there isn't a single Bible in the modern understanding of the word. Some might be surprised to learn that in the 15th century, the New Testament included more books than today. The opposite is true of the Old Testament. Some books that exist today were missing. They appeared later, in the canonical collection. In other words, even in the 16th century, the Old Testament wasn't complete. This point is witnessed in part in the main church book of the time, the Kormchaya Kniga, a book on canonical law, whose lists were compiled with precision. The first printed Bible only appeared in Russia in 1581. This was the well-known Ostrog Bible of Ivan Fyodorov. In fact, in the foreword to his publication, the Russian printer wrote that he experienced more difficulty in the search for incomplete biblical books. So, in dating the appearance of the first Russian canonical Bible, it is only possible to say with certainty the 16th century. In other Orthodox communities, the canonical Bible appeared even later. For example, it appeared in Greece 300 years after the Bible of Ivan Fyodorov in the 19th century. As for Europe, the Catholic Church recognized the biblical canon only in 1545, at the Council of Trent. This means that the Latin canonical Bible also appeared in the 16th century. Traditional history doesn't have an exact logical explanation for the late unification of the disparate biblical texts into a common canon. There also isn't a clear explanation for the absence in the 16th century of the books of Chronicles, Judith, and Maccabees from the Old Testament. There was no book of Ezra and no book of Nehemiah. It follows that if in the 16th century there was no book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, then the builders of the Moscow Kremlin couldn't have used it as a model. On the contrary, if we assume that the book only appeared at the end of the 16th century, then that means that the book was created at the same time as the construction of the Moscow Kremlin and could in fact be an account of those events. This event is well known in biblical history. There has been a great deal of research and inquiry about it, and it is important to many people today because the idea that the second Jerusalem described in the Bible is actually Moscow in the 16th century is not an insignificant point, but rather a very serious fact. And it changes a great deal, not only in our perception of the history of Moscow, but of the history of the Bible in general, especially the Old Testament. We will now follow the travels of the biblical Nehemiah and using concrete examples, examine how amazingly similar the Moscow Kremlin is to the Jerusalem of the Old Testament. We will use the text of the book of Nehemiah, taken not from one Bible, but from three, from different years of publication. In fact, the biblical texts were not simply rewritten and republished, but from publication to publication, they were thoroughly edited and changed. Therefore, a comparison of different texts will make our investigation more precise. The first text is from the Ostrog Bible, published in 1581 by the publisher Ivan Fyodorov by order of Duke Konstantin Ostrogsky. The second Bible is a reprinted publication of the Elizabeth Bible, which was published by command of Yelizaveta Petrovna in 1751. And finally, we will examine the most recognizable version for a modern reader, the Russian Bible, also known by the name the Russian Synodal Bible, which appeared in 1876. Part 3. Towers and Gates. According to the book of Nehemiah, along with the construction of the fortress walls of Jerusalem, they also built 6 fortress gates. Their construction is also described in the texts. And they built such gates and placed doors in them. It is known that there were 6 fortress gates in the Moscow Kremlin when it was built, exactly the same number as in the fortress of Jerusalem described in the Bible. Today, some of the gates have been sealed in, but in numerous old drawings and plans of the Moscow Kremlin from the end of the 16th to the 18th centuries, there are 6 gates. It is clearly visible on the first exact map of the Kremlin, called the Kremlingrad. The Sheep, or Spassky Tower. The first gates that come to mind from the Bible are the sheep gates, or herd gates. These gates refer to the Spassky gates of the Moscow Kremlin. In several places in the Bible, they are called the Jerusalem gates. The Spassky gates were also called the Jerusalem gates because they exited onto Jerusalem, another name for the Cathedral of Vasily the Blessed, or St. Basil's Cathedral. This is noted on several engravings, one of which is on display in the Museum of New Jerusalem in Istra, outside of Moscow. Through these gates on Palm Sunday, the Patriarch would perform the symbolic procession on a foal to the Moscow Jerusalem, the majestic Pokrovsky Cathedral. This was a ritual journey on a donkey, symbolizing the entrance of Jesus Christ into Jerusalem. These gates were also called the Fralovsky gates. It's possible that not far from the Spassky gates, there used to be a church of Saint Floris. It is well known that Saints Floris and Lauris are the patron saints of horses and horned cattle. That is why cathedrals in their honor were built near places with many animals. On old plans of the Kremlin, rows of shopping stalls across from the Spassky gates and next to the Pokrovsky Cathedral are labeled as shops where hides of various animals are sold. And the bank of the Moscow River at this point, across from the Kremlin, is known to this day as Ovchinikovskaya, so the Spassky gates could easily be called either Sheep Gates or Jerusalem Gates. The Fish or Konstantin Yeleninsky Gates. After the Sheep Gates, the Bible speaks of the Fish Gates. They perfectly correspond to the Konstantin Yeleninsky Tower. This tower gets its name from the church of Saints Constantine and Yelena, equal in stature to the apostles, built not far away in the Tainitsky garden of the Kremlin. Until 1917, this church was an ordinary parish temple. In 1928, the Bolsheviks destroyed the church. Originally, the tower contained a passageway into the Kremlin with gates. In the 18th century, the passageway through the Konstantin Yeleninsky Tower was destroyed, and the gates filled in, but they are clearly visible on an old plan of the Kremlin from that time. Across from the Konstantin-Yeleninsky gates of the Moscow Kremlin, there used to be rows of shopping stalls where they sold fish. To this day, there's a side street called Fish Alley. Those gates could full well be called the Fish Gates.